Eleanor Foregates by Ethel Carnie. Chapter 15. Love Triumphant. The little grey village was opening its doors to the sun, letting out breakfast smells. Many faces peered from the tiny pane-shining windows as Ellen and Martin passed through the lanes. According to Teddy Tripp's cousin, Margaret Tripp, Martin looked as though he had tumbled off a flitting, whilst the woman who walked at his side seemed to have lost her een to all but him. It was a new Foregates to Helen Mason. She was no longer afraid of it. She had Martin. With him she could live anywhere. She had discovered that Foregates had just meant Martin Scott. She was not afraid of it, but she was glad to get to the path leading up the hill to the farm. She could rest her hand within Martin's then. They had all the fear joy brings to those long desolate. Reaching the farm gate, Martin paused. Momentary shame revived in him again. The broken man's humiliation shone in his eyes. In this moment of agony, Helen's eyes caressed him. He smiled and passed in after her. They found the kitchen door ajar, swinging to and fro in the wind, just as Day had left it in his rush from the house. Helen entered first. She expected to find her father somewhat worse, but that glance at him as she entered the kitchen shocked her into a little cry of self-condemnation. The wretched man was laid naked, save for his woolen shirt, on the bed in the corner. The ashes from the dead fire were strewn on his pillow, blown there by the cold wind. The bedclothes, tossed from him in some paroxysm of rage, lay upon the floor, the blind dog huddling into them, bleeding from a wound Mason had managed to inflict by calling it to him, to vent upon the beast his thwarted spirit of hatred. The old man's mouth was a black parched cavern. His eyes glared like a savage animal's. Mumbles of incoherent curses tore themselves from his unslaked throat, but his eyes were the most terrible things to behold. They told the whole story. He was mad. "Sup, father, sup," said Ellen, rushing to him with a cup of barley water. Then to Martin, "Light the fire sharp. Get him summat warm. Get them salt bags out of cupboard." "Stir, Martin, stir," she ordered him, as in the old days. With his gaze fastened upon her face, reading it as the drink gurgled into him, part of it dribbled back into the cup. Abel Mason's hand clutched at Helen's as she held the vessel, supporting him with her other arm under the pillow. "Day'll murder thee," he gurgled against the cup's side. As he watched her face, hope died in his, its wild light retaken by the wilder one of despair. "Enough," he said, motioning the drink away. With a superhuman spring he had clawed at her, those long yellow nails of his ripping the white flesh of her arm. The cup clattered to the floor. "Blood!" he ejaculated drunkenly, seeing the gash. Helen threw herself between Martin and the bed. "I'll not touch him," he assured her, "but run down to the village and get 2 strong men. He'll get rough, he might hurt himself, and he's deeing anyway." "No, no," said Helen, flinging her hands before her face. "He's wur, but not deeing." The woman whom Abel Mason had reared only to torture was conscious of a strange kinship with him. He had robbed her of all but the remnants of joy, but half her wild soul was of his nourishing. "Deeing?" The man on the bed half roared the word. "Deeing? Me?" he exclaimed, digging his nails into the sheets. "No, I'll not dee. I'll not. Me work's not done." Then he said alertly, forcing that brain of his to the task, breaking machine though it was, "Where's he? Where?" He was asking for Day, his weapon. Helen Mason wavered. She had lied often, but not to the dying. Her life with Day had been a lie. She was sick of lies. "He's dead," she answered simply. There was a sound that made her start back, dropping the rug she was trying to tuck around the leaden feet. He had twitched at the sheet, tearing it into ribbons, his passion-distorted features, the bulging, red-glowing eyes with a tangle of white hair shaken over them, his mouth writhing, twisted words that were snarls of obscenity were a degradation to witness. He bore a resemblance to some white-haired giant ape, save for that spark of humanity that added loathsomeness to the display. It was the spirit of hatred starving in its den. "Warm him some milk, Martin," said Helen, her momentary horror gone. "He's clay cold." "My milk?" gasped Abel. "I want blood, the blood of every happy thing in world. My milk? I want the blood of thee, incense spawn." He was chewing at the sheet, spattered with Nero's blood, smacking at it as he finished. Martin had got the fire roaring and the salt bags over it on the shovel. Occasionally, as he turned them to get them evenly heated, he gave terse warnings that were commands to Helen, bidding her keep out of the reach of Mason's grip. "Aye, keep away from me," laughed the savage beast on the bed. Then, in the impotency of his rage, he spat out his obscene snarls once more. White as alabaster, her lips bitten, Helen went on tucking the clothes round him, tending always that spark of humanity in him, submerged as it was in the beast, whilst, with the cunning of the mad, he tried to drag her down with shame in Martin's sight. The man approached with the salt bags. "Stick these to his feet," he said taciturnly. He was telling himself the same thing as Helen, that Mason was dying, that they must be tender. He knelt down on the fender, raking at the fire to drown the sounds of those awful words. Helen took the bags to the cold feet. Then she brought the warm milk, held him up again. She was too quick for that lightning clutch at her hair, and stood pale and panting, leaning against the wall. There was no fear or horror in her look. She was merely protecting herself. He spurted the drink from his mouth upon her, mingled with that trickling saliva. She wiped it calmly from her cheek. "He's getting energy," murmured Martin. "Run and fetch somebody. It isn't his own strength. He'll de-rage in." "Fetch parson," gasped the old man. "Get him to pray. He." "Lie down," pleaded Helen. "You're shortening your life." He raised himself on his elbow. The compassion on the woman's face, the soft, moved look of it, the sight of the tears trembling on her lashes, the tears of the happy weeping for the wretched, stung him into frenzy. "Thy mother were her." He stopped suddenly. His gaze was glued to a space of wall where a ray of sunlight stole in through the chink of the blind. "It's true," he defied something hollowly. "It's true. Take thy black hair from my throat, Helen Inson. Take it to hell, Helen. Luke, what's that?" He had turned to Helen with a note of human fear, addressing flesh and blood. But as she put her hand out to soothe him, the threat in his eyes, the infuriated look at finding himself appealing to her, made her draw it back. His yellow stumps of teeth crashed together, closing on air. He fell back on his pillow. After a few minutes in which Helen had warmed a blanket, wrapping it round him whilst he looked the murder he could not effect, he muttered, "I want to eat. I'll be better tomorrow. I am not deeing. I can't dee." He lay back once more, speechless, but looking curses at them, at the two who had come together despite him. "He'll get wild again. Go for somebody to hold him down," said Martin. The strange primitive dignity of Helen asserted itself unreasonably. "No, he shan't be held down," she said irrationally. Then she shuddered. "Think of being so full of hate," she said. "The bitterness, the emptiness." The eyes were unclosing again. "Keep thy damned pity," mumbled Mason. "Lift dog on bed. It's me only friend." Slinking and whining, the poor beast was lifted up. "Let me stroke it," pleaded the old man. Then, as it was placed within range, he clawed at it, laughing shrilly, till exhausted at its howls. Martin had snatched it away and gave it warm milk to lap. Helen moved about, straightening the kitchen. Martin sat in his old chair. Something was bubbling in a saucepan. From a slight stupor the old man awoke, opening his eyes. He screamed in agony. Helen rushed to the bed. "Go away," he yelled to her, his glance including Martin. "Have I to see you sitting so happy when I'm in grave?" "Let's go out," said Helen brokenly. They stood together in the garden looking down the hill, leaving him alone, but near enough to run if he should want them. His voice, rising higher, came to them at intervals. He was insisting on another life, telling himself it must be, because he craved it so, to complete his hate. He shouted with curses for life upon life, till his work was done. The sun was shining on the hillside, bringing a hint of green to it. "I never knew I cared. He brought me up," said Helen. Her hand was cold in Martin's clasp. Her eyes motioned his to the sunlight and the sky. "Can it ever say the same again?" she asked wearily. "All that hate." It was Martin's turn to comfort. Then he said, "Hush." There was a movement within the kitchen. They entered. Mason had crept out of bed and was sitting on the edge of it. Some spurt of strength had entered the wasted frame, tottering on the brink of the grave. "Lift me up," he begged. "Let me look at fire." Helen ignored Martin's look. Placing her hands firmly under his armpits, she walked him over step by step towards the fire. He looked at it with a comforted expression, mumbling about the cold. The mighty brain, with its last spark of consciousness, was plotting. "Are you warmer?" asked Helen's voice gently. "Maybe you'll get better." A cry from Martin arrested her attention. With a backward movement of cunning, Mason had grasped the thin, worn carving knife from the table. The feeble body nerved itself in answer to that last command of the brain, yet to win its way. "Let go of him," shouted Martin. "I can't," answered Helen, shutting her eyes. The old thin body would crash to the ground if she let go. Martin rushed towards the old man, trying vainly to cover the space before that knife descended into the woman's breast. Then there was a snarl of savage lust, the mingled voices of man and beast. The old man's foot had touched the dog's bleeding side as Nero drank the milk. There was the thud of a heavy body crashing against the old man, the flash of teeth, and the blind dog had turned on his master, stung into treachery by the impulse of self-preservation, the hatred of pain. "The stick!" Martin rushed for it in answer to Helen's cry. The two rolling forms were on the floor now, snarling and yelling. Mason was biting at the dog at Mason. Before Martin reached Nero with the stick, all was over. Both lay very still, but the dog's side was throbbing and bleeding, whilst low whines of fear and degradation broke from him. He had outraged great laws. He had bitten his master. Helen sat with the old man's head on her lap. In her struggles to get Nero off him, her hair had tumbled about her. It swept the distorted, grinning face of hate near her breast. The eyes opened to see Helen's face. 10,000 eternities to hate in, he breathed painfully. "Curse you both and your childer's childer. 10,000 etern—" He choked midway in the crave. The rattle was in his throat. He clutched at air. Helen leaned close down to him, her eyes staring into his, that kinship in her, calling to him with a sob. "You're all the father I've known. I like you," with a vain endeavour to give him love despite himself. He stared back into those eyes, like the other Helen's, at the air like his rivals. He was fighting with death. "I hate," he said vehemently. He spat at her. The glare of his eyes was furnace fierce. Quite suddenly his head fell back, the repulsive grin of hate still living in the dying, becoming fixed. The light was fading from his eyes. Martin, sobbed Helen. Martin Scott bent down. "It's over," he said. "Poor old devil." He wiped the spittle that had cost Mason his last breath from Helen's shuddering cheek. "To do so," she shivered. "I'll have to fetch someone," he said. "Don't leave me, Martin," shrilled Helen. That dead face was too terrible to look on. Together they went down to the village. They learnt there that a man named Jim Brett, a tramp, had given himself up to the local constable. He had pushed Day into eternity on the impulse of the minute. Sleeping at last in the wet bracken after a shivering night, and dreaming of Sarah, he had been awakened to see Day. The sight of the tin god had been too much for him. When Martin and Helen got back with the doctor, the eyes of Helen Mason, closed gently by Martin, had half unclosed again. They stared at all who looked, until the coffin lid covered them. The old man's will left all to Day, whilst he lived with Helen. The mortality of Day had, curiously enough, never entered either Mason's mind or Day's. The tin god had left no will. Helen and Martin Scott would have a pot of brass. There were one or two people who specially went out of their way to Cobblestone's farm to ask how Helen came to be away from home without her husband, as she must have been not to be with him when he was killed. But as Lizzie thought that lies were good enough for busybodies, they went away as wise as they came. Spring. The wind laughed in the green bracken. A million heads tossed at once. A brute tumbled and laughed with a gurgle of clear joy, and mixing in with it was a woman's laugh as clear and happy. Away ahead she could see Martin. He had left her, parting the bracken to make her a path through it. She could just see the top of his head and the movement his hands made, tossing the bracken on each side. He had left her. She had vowed she could manage that steep ascent through the bracken all by herself. It was a challenge. Her feet went into splashes of diamond-clear water left by the tumbling of the stream. They stuck into the clean dirt. She stopped sometimes to look at the sky, peeping back at her through the bracken. "Hush!" called Martin suddenly. She stopped. "What is it?" she breathed. "A sandpiper," he told her. "Shh!" The sweet, sad thread of sound palpitated on the air. "The first I've heard," he confided to her as she reached him. She stood looking at him, whilst he stared in the direction of the sandpiper's cry. In his eyes was the reflection of her own face. "Theg's are bad to find," he ruminated, then gave a muted cry of delight. She followed his gaze into the sky that made her dizzy. Round and round it, in anxious parental care, went a couple of peewits. "There's a nest somewhere near," he whispered. He went stealthily, watching at times the tricks of the parents to divert his attention, catching all the notes of those voices away up in the sky. Then, as he gained the moor-top, he stalked along right to the nest. In a hollow of the rushy ground were 3 baby plovers. There were 3 bunches of soft brown with bright eyes. Martin handed one to Helen. She rubbed her cheek against it, crooning. Then she glanced with quick sympathy at the birds above. Their voices were insane with terrified passion now. Anger, grief, lament floated down to them. Helen touched Martin on the arm, dragged him away, hastened his putting the birds back into the nest in the ground. "It's a wonderful thing to hold in your hand what'll travel round and round the sky," he said. He took her hand in his, and they swung across the moor-top, through the rushes that glistened in the sunshine like thousands of knitting needles, and the shining grass, and over the soppy mosses and the bents. When they could see the Cobblestones, They had climbed the heights from the opposite side. He stopped. "Whilst the rocks shall stand," he said, suddenly speaking from some depths within himself. The woman understood and smiled. They sat down to eat, resting on a springy couch of heather. Below them unrolled to view the splendour of a springtime vale, where 1,000 daisies were staring at the sun in golden-eyed joy of life. "I believe," said Martin, in a voice of faith, "I shall live to be 80 and hobble on a stick." There was no answer but a quiet smile from the woman at his side. "Teddy's farm needn't be a failure," he went on thoughtfully. "This year I shall sow." A cloud of grouse flew across near to them, and Martin forgot to complete his sentence. From perfect tower to perfect tower they went over the moor, or rested, till the dusk crept down, and a lonely dog that guarded the sheep followed them back for company, until dismissed by Martin. Then, through the mist, they saw the twinkling light of their nest, Corplestone's farm, and went down towards it, hand in hand, following the same star. The end. This audiobook was brought to you by the Northern Grove Publishing Project and malcsbooks.com in support of the Working Class Movement Library, 51 The Crescent, Salford, M5 4WX.